To understand the United States' idea of acquiring Greenland, we need to go back far, not to the Cold War era nor to the 20th century, but to the historical and legal foundations that shape Greenland's position in the international system. Because Greenland is not an empty territory without history, nor is it a piece of land that can be transferred through negotiations between great powers. It is a living space with a long colonial history, a complex legal structure, and a constantly transforming political identity. Long before Greenland appeared on the modern geopolitical map, this region had been the living space of the Inuit people for thousands of years, a society that developed social, economic, and knowledge systems completely rooted in the Arctic environment. Hunting methods, navigating the sea ice, and spiritual relationships with nature are not mere adaptations, but a way of life. A civilization that is mature, sustainable, and sovereign over its own living space. According to Lassi Heinen, the Inuit people have what is called indigenous ecological knowledge, which is local ecological knowledge that allows them to survive and thrive in one of the most extreme environments in the world. This fact is important because from the beginning, Greenland was not an empty territory or an ownerless land, but a social space that had long been organized by humans. However, when Europe entered the era of global expansion, the logic of territorial control was not based on the existence of local populations, but rather on political claims and symbols of sovereignty. Greenland began to enter the imagination of European powers through relations between Denmark and Norway, especially from the 18th century. According to Ulrik Prom-God, the missionary expedition led by Hans Egede in 1721 is often framed as a religious mission, but in fact it functions as a gateway to colonialism. Through religion, trade, and administration, the Danes began to instill power structures that slowly shifted the social authority of the Inuit people. Over time, the Danish presence hardened into a closed colonial system. Greenland is managed through a state trade monopoly. Foreign access is restricted, and all policies are regulated from Copenhagen. Local residents are positioned as objects of development and modernization, not as political subjects with a voice. And this colonization was not an instant event, but rather a long process of administrative and cultural subjugation. Inuit identity was forced to negotiate with colonial identity. And it was from this point on that Greenland's history began to be framed by the tension between local life and the logic of the modern European state. Entering the 20th century, major changes occurred in the international order. 2 world wars shook the legitimacy of colonialism and gave birth to new norms about sovereignty, human rights, and the right of nations to self-determination. Greenland, which has been on the fringes of global attention, is starting to enter the international spotlight. According to Maria Akren, after World War II, Denmark faced strong political pressure to explain Greenland's status to the United Nations. As a colony, Greenland has the potential to be included in the list of non-self-governing territories that must undergo a decolonization process. And to avoid such pressure, Denmark took a strategic step. In 1953, through a constitutional change, Greenland was officially integrated as an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland was removed, and the territory was declared a constitutional part of the country. However, this change is more of a formal legal nature than a real transformation of power. Why is that? Because although Greenland was no longer a colony, political decision-making remained centralized in Denmark. Administrative, economic, and public policy were still dominated by central interests. According to Maria Akren, Denmark's modernization during this period was often rapid and top-down. European-style urbanization, education, and economic restructuring were implemented without fully considering local social and cultural structures. This resulted in various social problems, ranging from community dislocation to an identity crisis within Greenlandic society. In the framework of the modern state system, Greenland clearly found itself in an ambiguous position. Legally part of Denmark, yet socially and politically, it still experienced unequal power relations. This ambiguity gave rise to new political demands from the Greenlandic people themselves. It was from this tension between formal status and reality that new political demands began to shape form. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, a movement for autonomy emerged in Greenland. The demands of the autonomy movement in Greenland do not always emerge as a desire for separation, but rather as an effort to regain control over one's daily life and one's own future. Maria Auckland recounts that an important milestone occurred in 1979 with the implementation of Home Rule. For the first time, Greenland has a democratically elected local government with authority to regulate domestic affairs, such as education, health, culture, and local administration. This Home Rule also marked a fundamental change in power relations. Greenland is no longer fully governed from Copenhagen. However, this autonomy still has clear limits. Strategic issues such as defense, foreign policy, security, and monetary policy remain in Denmark's hands. But as Greenland's sense of national identity grows, these boundaries are increasingly being questioned, and political debates are no longer confined to domestic governance, but are beginning to touch on more substantive issues of sovereignty. The culmination of this process occurred in 2009 with the passing of the Act on Greenland's Self-Government. Malcolm Nathan Shaw explains that the recognition of a group as a people in international law has enormous implications. In this law, the people of Greenland are explicitly recognized as a people, which means they have the right to self-determination. Additionally, self-government transferred control over natural resources into the hands of the Greenlandic government, which was a crucial change, because natural resources are not only an economic issue, but also the foundation of political sovereignty. But even so, compromise was maintained. Denmark still manages defense and foreign relations, and it is in this context that Greenland is in a unique position, because even though Greenland has self-government, the right to determine its future and control over its resources, Greenland remains within the constitutional framework of the Kingdom of Denmark. This status makes Greenland a difficult political entity to classify, neither a fully independent state nor a colony, and not to be equated with an ordinary administrative region. It is this lack of clarity in categories that often opens up room for misinterpretation in global political practices. And it is from this point that fundamental questions arise in today's international system. Can a territory like Greenland still be treated as an object that can be purchased by other countries? The answer, under modern international law, is no. Malcolm Nathan Shaw explains that the practice of buying and selling territory between countries is a legacy of the 18th and 19th centuries, when sovereignty was understood to belong to the king or the state, not to the people. In this system, territory can be treated as an object of transaction, such as the Louisiana Purchase or the purchase of Alaska by the United States from Russia. But this paradigm changed radically after the Second World War. The United Nations Charter affirms the principle of self-determination as a fundamental norm. This principle states that the territory inhabited by a nation cannot be transferred its sovereignty without the free consent of the people inhabiting that territory. In this context, Greenland has a very clear legal position. Greenland is not empty land, not a territory without people, and nor is it a colony completely under the control of a colonial country. And since the passing of the Act on Greenland's Self-Government in 2009, the people of Greenland have been explicitly recognized as a people in the sense of international law. This admission immediately carries major legal implications. Malcolm Nathan Shaw explains that once a community is recognized as a people, any change in the political status of the territory must involve their will. In other words, even Denmark, which formally manages Greenland's defense and foreign relations, has no legal right to sell or transfer Greenland to another party. Herein lies the main problem with the discourse on the acquisition of Greenland by the United States. This idea is not only diplomatically problematic, but also contradicts the basic principles of contemporary international law. This, in turn, disregards the political rights of the Greenlandic people and revives the colonial logic abandoned by the global system after 1945. Therefore, when the idea of acquiring Greenland resurfaced in American political discourse, many European countries viewed it not as a realistic proposal, but as a normative regression, an old perspective that is no longer in line with the modern international legal order. However, this criticism does not mean that the United States is completely detached from the history of Greenland. On the other hand, the relationship between the United States and Greenland has existed for quite a long time, especially since the mid-20th century. Ulrich Promgod said that Greenland's position began to change strategically since World War II, when the United States realized the importance of the Arctic region for the defense of North America. In the context of the Nazi-German threat, America established a military presence in Greenland with the consent of Denmark, which was then under occupation. This relationship was formally institutionalized through a 1951 defense treaty between Denmark and the United States. This treaty gave the United States the right to build, manage, and operate a military base in Greenland, now known as Pituffik Space Base. However, it is also important to underline that America's presence in Greenland is based on treaty, not sovereignty. America has never had a legal claim to the territory of Greenland. All its military activities are within the framework of permission and cooperation with Denmark, and in recent developments with the autonomous government of Greenland. History records that the United States has considered the possibility of purchasing Greenland several times. Maria Akron stated that this discourse emerged at least in 1867 to 1946 and resurfaced in the 21st century. However, all these efforts have always failed, either because of Denmark's rejection or because of the lack of legal and political legitimacy. Thus, the position of the United States in Greenland's history is paradoxical. On one hand, America is a major strategic partner and the most important security actor in the region. On the other hand, America has never had and does not have any legal basis to own Greenland. It is this tension that explains why every statement by America about taking over Greenland triggers great unease. Why is that? Because the statement is not just crude diplomacy, but touches on the sensitive boundary between security cooperation and claims of sovereignty, between strategic access and the right to self-determination. It is in this context that Greenland is understood not only as a strategic Arctic region, but also as a real test. Do the world's great powers still think with 19th century logic, or are they truly subject to 21st century international law? From this, we can see that the Greenland controversy is not from sudden ambition, but from the collision between old geopolitical logic and modern international law. So when America talks about acquisitions, what is at stake is not just bilateral relations, but the legal and moral foundations of the post-colonial international order. This understanding is key to reading the strong reactions of Denmark, the European Union, and the Greenlandic government itself. If Greenland cannot be bought, and if its sovereignty is legally protected, then the next question becomes much more important. Why does the United States remain so obsessed with this region? The answer lies not in a single factor. America's interests in Greenland are intertwined with three major interrelated layers: strategic security, great power competition in the Arctic, and access to crucial 21st century resources. And Greenland is not an end in itself, but a key node in the broader global map. This framework explains why Greenland continues to figure in Washington's strategic calculations, even though its legal and political status precludes its being treated as a transferable commodity. It is this tension between normative limitations and strategic interests that makes Greenland's position so sensitive in contemporary international politics. And that sensitivity is nothing new, because since the mid-20th century, Greenland has occupied a crucial strategic position, where this region is not just a large island in the North Atlantic, but one of the anchor points of the North American defense system. And this role began to crystallize during the Second World War. When Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940, the United States, with the consent of the Danish government, took over responsibility for Greenland's defense. This step, as previously mentioned, was then agreed upon in the agreement pursuant to the North Atlantic Treaty concerning the defense of Greenland between the United States and Denmark. The agreement granted the United States the right to construct and operate military facilities in Greenland, including the Thule Air Base, which remains a key symbol of American security interests in the region. James Kraska explains that Thule Air Base is not just an ordinary overseas base, but an integral part of the United States' early warning system against transcontinental ballistic missile attacks. Greenland's geographic location right between North America and Eurasia makes it the shortest path for missiles from Russia to the United States. In military logic, whoever controls this point controls the most crucial sky corridor in modern strategic warfare. This role became increasingly relevant after the Cold War. Although the global nuclear threat had subsided in the 1990s, Russia's rise as a military power and its nuclear modernization revived Greenland's significance. Former NATO commander James Stavridis once described Greenland as an absolute linchpin, with radar and sensor systems in the region serving as the United States' first eyes and ears for detecting potential strategic attacks from the Arctic. In other words, Greenland is not just a cold and sparsely populated region, but a core component of the United States' territorial defense itself. This is why Washington's interest in Greenland is structural and long-term. It is not merely a fleeting political maneuver. As the environment changes and the global power constellation shifts, Greenland's security dimension can no longer be understood solely within the framework of the US-Denmark bilateral agreement. The region now sits within a broader geopolitical landscape, where the Arctic is slowly transforming into a space of great power competition.